coming up. But Josh McCuistion, SoonerScoop.com, joins us now. Longtime guest, going back a couple of different talk shows with Josh McCuistion. Josh, it was a rocky year for the Sooners on the field. And, starting with Lincoln Riley leaving last year and Brent Venables and everything that's happened, how do you feel they responded to that today on signing day?
Well, it's an interesting thing because if you want to look over what has happened since Brent Venables arrived all the way to today, you feel pretty good about it as far as recruiting goes. Going to be a top 10 class by some measurements, top 6, top 7. It's a good group. There's no doubt. And I think the thing that you look at is you say, well, this group, for all the Lincoln Riley left and all the problems they were going to have, they still landed the 5-star quarterback that, Oklahoma had kind of just become synonymous with. But at the same time, landed one of the best defensive classes they've landed in, 10 or 15 years. So that's a great start. Today itself didn't go all that well, with Oklahoma missing out on both Peyton Bowen and Tassili Akana. And in Akana's case, not only did you lose him, you lost him to Texas. So it's a little bit of a rough signing day for Oklahoma.
Josh, there's obviously a difference in the way I would say Venables approaches it as opposed to previous coaches, but with the SEC stuff lingering, looming, however you want to phrase it, upcoming sooner than probably 2024, 25 or 2024 looking like when it was going to start, I should say. Do you see a difference in their recruiting as far as the trenches or anything along those lines?
Well, defensively, I definitely do. They landed a guy in PJ Adebawore, one of the best defensive ends in the country, All-American, all the stuff that you're looking for. Have a couple other guys in the defensive line class that are good, solid players that I think probably wouldn't be part of this class under the previous regime. So I do see positive signs. They clearly, missing out on David Hicks out of Houston was a really tough loss. I mentioned Tassili Akana, losing Colton Vosick, although that one, you just kind of understand. That's a Texas kid. There was a lot of, I think it was more surprising you ever had a real chance with him than the fact that they lost him. So I do think you're seeing good things offensively. It's still Bill Bedenbaugh. He's still doing all the stuff he does. And I think they put together another good offensive line class, with, one of the headliners being a borderline 5-star guy. So they have good pieces up front, and there's no question. It is a different philosophy where the line of scrimmage is what Brent Venables spends most of his time thinking about. There's no question.
Jackson Arnold, the 5-star QB commit, that's the one of the other diamonds of the class. Josh, this was, I'm sure, a guy that had to fight off a long time, but They didn't get bad news this morning that Oregon had stolen their guy. So how do they feel about him coming in? And given, of course, their quarterback depth right now behind Dillon Gabriel, how quickly could this guy see some significant playing time, given that Dillon Gabriel took some bumps and bruises last year?
I think it's interesting from both sides of that quarterback room, because if you look at it from Jackson Arnold's side, the expectation is he's going to take over the reins in 2024. So Oklahoma's going to want to get him snaps. They're going to want to, whether it's building in some packages for him or he can run some things he's comfortable with, and let that kind of expand as the year goes on, or, just really letting him truly compete, which they will. There's no question. He's too talented not to be given a legitimate shot. But I think it's funny. OU fans kind of have this image that Dillon Gabriel's not very good. And I'm like, I think that's more to do with what you've become accustomed to. I think Oklahoma fans assume every quarterback should be a Heisman Trophy candidate or they're not good enough. And I think Dillon Gabriel, for the most part of last year, was a winning level quarterback. So I think they'll be patient. What I do think is interesting is having a guy like Jackson Arnold that I think Oklahoma by mid-season is going to feel comfortable. If he's got to come in and play a half or something, they're going to feel okay. What does that allow them to do with Dillon Gabriel? Do they get a little more run heavy with him in the offense? Because that's something Jeff Levy loved to do at Ole Miss with Matt Corral. Can they incorporate that a little bit more, and does that open up some things for this offense?
So the other 5-star on the defensive side of the ball, I'm probably going to butcher his name, but Adebawore out of Kansas City, Missouri, dipping into very familiar territory there in Missouri. But what was kind of the background, the story here to getting a coveted 5-star edge rusher?
Well, and that's the thing you see. Brent Venables, with all of, it's a change of where your focus is. With Lincoln Riley, there was so much Southern California and just really West Coast in general, where he really went out and dipped his toe and had a lot of success out there. And obviously it worked out pretty well for him on a couple of fronts. But with Brent, there's always been, he's a Kansas guy. I mean, he's very familiar with Kansas City, St. Louis, kind of recruiting that whole corridor. And I think that is what you saw here. They got in on PJ. And to make it simple, I go with PJ
yeah,
for instead
that works.
just for brevity's sake. But he is a guy that was like a 3-star at the time they offered him. Wasn't well known, had some good offers. His older brother actually is at Northwestern and just entered the NFL draft and is probably a second, third round guy. So I mean, there's some pedigree there to say that okay, this guy's going to come along. But he really didn't even play defensive end until his junior year of high school. His coaches kept kind of putting him at tight end and letting him move around. Well, he goes, I think he had 18 sacks as a junior or something. I mean, they kind of figured, oh, this guy's really good and he's special. Came back this year, I think ended up with like 40 tackles for loss as a senior, some crazy number like that. And, Oklahoma, like I said, he committed in early summer and then just kind of watched his stock continue to elevate as people got more familiar with him, saw his tape, and he's the prototype. I mean, he's 6'4.5", 230 pounds, runs extremely well. And I think what's special about him is his change of direction. He really is a guy that should be an elite pass rusher in fairly short order.
You mentioned the focus of Lincoln Riley on the West Coast. Brent Venables and staff has 6 kids in this class from Florida. Is that the SEC influence there a little bit too?
Absolutely. I mean, everybody's familiar with all the work Clemson did in Florida, going back to like Sammy Watkins, C.J. Spiller, some great players at Clemson that came from the state of Florida. Brent Venables was very open. From the day he got there, they were going to work the Southeast. They were going to go compete with all the big boys down there. And I think they did an outstanding job. They're obviously fighting a little bit with their hands tied behind their back, being a school a little farther that's not currently part of the SEC, and is certainly not a school that these kids associate as of yet with the SEC. So I think they had to work a little bit uphill, but a couple of the guys they got in state, Lewis Carter, namely, is a guy that I'm just a huge fan of. Really kind of a diverse talent, could be a linebacker, could be a safety. He's kind of one of those hybrid guys that we see more and more of in college football these days. But I just think he has a world of ability. And if there was one guy in this class that I was going to say, I would bet my last dollar he is a good college football player, Lewis Carter would kind of be that guy. I really like all of his mentality. He kind of has some leadership skills. So I do. I like what they've done in Florida. Derek LeBlanc was a big win, guy they were recruiting at Clemson. So anytime you're able to go into Florida and land guys that they wanted at Clemson, that's a really good starting place for Oklahoma and where they're at right now.
Josh, looking at the transfer part of this class, because that's now like the norm is the transfer aspect of everything. They got a huge win with Deshaun McCullough coming over from Indiana. That was widely celebrated. Jacob Lacey, another big get. And then the kind of fun story of Austin Stogner returning to where it started. But how big of a kind of a shake did you feel with the McCullough news and how coveted he was?
Oh, I think that was, honestly, one of the savvier things I've seen Oklahoma do, because they started recruiting his younger brother, Day, who at the time was a Cincinnati commitment, and in the class of 2023. And obviously he signed as well today. So they started recruiting him about 6 weeks ago. It felt kind of fruitless. Like, what are you going to do here? But then Luke Fickell goes to Wisconsin. The door just swings wide open. And then all of a sudden Deshaun's in the portal from Indiana. And so it just kind of worked out really naturally and really well for Oklahoma. But he's a day one starter. I mean, he really is that kind of guy. And talking to some people around the program, there are comparisons made to Isaiah Simmons. Like, they think he is that kind of impact guy, the former Butkus winner at Clemson. So they have a big belief. Now, he's a different kind of player, but they just see that kind of level of impact because he can rush off the edge. They can drop him into coverage. He can work against tight ends. there's just a lot they like there, and I would expect him to be a guy that's nearly impossible for OU to keep off the field.
Josh, do you feel like their issues on defense were talent or just adjusting to Brent Venables' scheme?
A little bit of both. And I think the biggest talent hurdle was at defensive line. They just don't have the people there. And I know people will say, oh, maybe Lincoln Riley wasn't recruiting well, but it's not just that. And because the previous year, Oklahoma had multiple guys going to the NFL draft. I think 4 out of that front 7 were drafted the year before. So some of it was just natural turnover that was going to happen. And I think Oklahoma kind of struggled to replace that. Had a lot of young guys that they liked. They lost a couple of guys in what was going to be a very good recruiting class, a couple of top 100 type young defensive linemen that they had thought they could add to the roster and could kind of work their way into the rotation. Those guys went to Michigan, went to Texas A&M, and they just kind of missed out. So I think they just kind of had to have a hodgepodge last year. They struggled to create pressure without blitzing, and obviously when you blitz, you leave people in man coverage in the back. So I think they just fell into some traps and some trouble. Brent Venables didn't forget how to coach defense when he left Clemson, South Carolina. So I think it will get better, and I think there's a lot of talent in the back 7, but they still have to figure out that front 7. The front 4.
So would that be, if I ask you the question of where do they look now as they sort of like regroup after signing day number 1, is that where you're eyeing as far as filling in pieces for the rest of the roster?
To me, that's the biggest thing, because I think, they have a needed receiver, which it looks like they're in pretty good shape to do some work in the portal. A guy named Trey Harris out of Louisiana Tech. I think they're in very good shape there. Maybe Caden Prather from West Virginia. There are some pieces that I think they're going to land that will help them at receiver. Defensive line, if they can find a guy to help create some pressure, and I don't know if he's got to be a slightly undersized guy, because we all know the deal. There's not many of those guys in the portal,
right?
Because if they wouldn't go to the portal, guys like that either stay where they are, sign big NIL deals, or they go to the NFL draft. I mean, there's really no reason to go to the portal if you're that kind of difference maker at that position. So we will see what comes of it. But like I said, I think that's the difference between Oklahoma really making a step next year and just kind of improving within Brent Venables' defense.
Josh, thank you so much for hopping on today. Enjoy the holidays, and always great to talk to you.
Absolutely. Merry Christmas, guys. Enjoy it.
Thanks, Josh. Joshua Quiston, SoonerScoop.com, with us here on 365 Sports.